Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, today we've heard a bit about the importance of scientific integrity and transparency, and I want to agree with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle and say that that is two fundamental principles with which I could not agree more. However, I'm concerned that the bill before us today doesn't achieve those goals and instead puts our country at greater risk of not being able to use the best available, most up-to-date science to protect our health and public safety. Currently, the EPA incorporates science in the regulatory process through a number of procedures, including extensive outside peer review prior to consideration by the agency's internal process. Prior to any action, the EPA must go through an extensive rulemaking process that incorporates printing all relevant information in the Federal Register, which is publicly available, a draft rule, a public comment period, responding to those public comments, and then issuing a final rule, a process that takes considerable amount of time with extensive input from interested parties. Last, as the majority indicated in the memorandum of today's markup, all Federal agencies that support scientific research are already under direction by the President and the Office of Science and Technology Policy to make said research publicly available where appropriate, include data and models used to support the science. The EPA is currently in the process of developing its own public access policy consistent with OSTP. Unfortunately, I'm concerned that the underlying bill only creates unnecessary bureaucratic hurdles and actually prohibits the EPA from using sound science. It creates confusing and likely unworkable requirements, limiting the scientific research that can be used unless it can be publicly accessible. The EPA relies on science that often includes personally identifiable information, which cannot simply be made publicly available due to privacy concerns, which is why EPA already has important peer review standards in place and has previously supported independent analyses of studies in accordance with privacy protections set forth by law. In this committee, we've talked about the importance of the Federal Government protecting private information. I cannot support an effort to either require the EPA to disclose protected health information or simply not use it. My amendment upholds the high standard set by the EPA using the latest, most up-to-date science. It prohibits the EPA from proposing, finalizing, or disseminating a covered action unless all science and technical information is specifically identified, requiring the EPA to identify the science being used to engage in any regulatory action. It ensures we use base regulations on sound science and allows the EPA to continue their efforts to make all information publicly available as applicable by law in coordination with the OSTP directive. Mr. Chairman, specifically, the amendment basically, if you look through the text, it strikes on page 2, lines 10 through 15. It puts in that it leaves in subsection A and says that it has to be specifically identified. I'm concerned that the language of actually, and I take my colleagues' comments on the last amendment are well noted. I'm concerned that the way that the language is actually drafted, it creates a bit of an ambiguity saying that the EPA, unless noting from subsection 2, noting that nothing shall be construed as requiring publicly a dissemination of information, the disclosure of which is prohibited by law, if there's private information there that the EPA cannot disclose by law, then they cannot actually implement the regulation because of subsection B. And what I'm basically saying is take out that ambiguity, keep in the specifically identified so that we know what the research actually is so that there is accountability, but to try to remove that ambiguity of creating a requirement that the EPA cannot comply with under law. That's essentially what we're trying to do, is just simplify the regulation. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr.